from Russia, who got under home arrest just yesterday, and there's a criminal case opened against them, and so they actually risk ending up in prison for several years. And your support, I think, might help. There's some detail to be found if you. Yeah, thank you for all those who have just signed. I'm sure that this is a thing that will pay off sooner or later. Okay, thank you, Vassily, and thank you, Nico, for inviting me. Probably, I guess we can start. Well, what I'm going to do today is to suggest some thoughts on one of the issues I think that appears in David's work, and one of the issues that is I don't think is really properly dealt with by people who have written on David Graeber so far. So I will share my thoughts with you and suggest a few questions to you, and we'll be happy to hear from you and hear your feedback. Obviously, I don't have any answers, so that's just an experiment for me trying to tackle these questions. Just a few words about myself. I'm heading an MA program in political philosophy at the Moscow School of Social Economic Sciences. I'm doing theory of democracy, but I'm also doing economic philosophy and economic theology. And I suppose that I was invited to do that because of my role in translating David's bullshit jobs in Russian. We did that just last year, and the book was out last summer, I guess. We were hoping to have David in Moscow, but because of COVID, that obviously failed. And then we switched to online presentation. That was the one of the last talks I think he gave, regretfully. And I can say that I was really shocked by him passing away. I mean, I don't think I have really recovered from that, but I'm certain that there's a lot of issues left in David's work, also upcoming work to be published, but in the work already published. So I would like to do today's discussion on the bullshit jobs, and addressing specifically, this is a huge book, and in his manner he deals with a lot of issues, just in a quite a superficial manner, but offers very interesting insights here and there. This is one of the things that I'm impressed with in David's work, that he distributes those insights without really developing them. And these are things that you come across and think, wow, that actually changes the way I've been thinking about the whole topic. And then he goes further without really commenting on that. So it would be probably useless to deal with the whole book, even with those two chapters that I'm offering today, chapters 3 and 4. So I'm going to concentrate on one specific issue. This is the issue of economic motivation. Well, obviously, David is very successful, I think, in debunking the myth of economics, with the idea that there's only one way to make people work, to make people engage in economic activity, but more specifically to make people work. And according to this myth, of course, the humans are opportunistic profit seekers, and they're only acting out of self-interest. and then there's only one way to force them to work, just through compulsion. There's no other way to do that, because otherwise they would stay lazy the whole life. The theory is stupid, and David is, I think, quite successful in destroying it. And of course, I mean, I guess every anthropologist, every social scientist beyond the field of economics is just happy to read all that. And I'm sure people like share this feeling. Oh my! Finally, somebody says that is just absolutely stupid to think of humans in that way. But in that joy that many of us share, there's also an issue arising, and at least for me, it is easy to skip this issue, being overwhelmed with this joy. And the issue is, and why specifically would people work? What specifically would people want to work? What is exactly their motivation? Okay, economists are definitely wrong with that. It's not the issue of compulsion. But what exactly is the motivation? Why exactly would people work? If we stop forcing them to work, then what would be the incentives for them to work? And that matters, because the structure of these incentives actually will influence what is the work that they would be willing to do, what's the work that probably wouldn't be willing to do. And if we are thinking of some future society in which forced labor isn't removed completely, then we have to think how we could alleviate the forced work. What are the domains that probably need some compulsion, and what are the domains that can be easily freed from any kind of compulsory work? So the question is, why would people work? What's the motivation for work? Of course, we know, we can think of various theories dealing with this issue, and certainly economists have no monopoly on this topic. The sociologists would definitely think of Weber's theory of motivation, where he differentiates between the goal-oriented rational action, the value-oriented rational action, the traditional action, and the affect motivated action. But I don't think it really fits with what David has to say about that. Given particularly his very critical account of a Protestant ethic that is forcing us to treat, to separate the joy and the work, to treat the work as something hard, difficult, and totally separated from any kind of feeling of fulfillment. Now, when we look at his own theory, the closest that he gets at his own theory is the reflection on this concept of pleasure as being a cause of something, introduced by Gross. So he goes to Gross and borrows this idea that actually humans are willing to do something because they feel a pleasure at causing things and observing the effects of their actions. Going even as far as saying that when we fail to do that, when we fail to observe the effects of our actions, that actually causes trauma, it traumatizes us, and we have to deal with these kinds of trauma quite often. Particularly when we're, as children, we are devoid of this feeling of us being a cause of something. Uh, well, that's actually pretty close to what in some psychological theories of motivation they will call the intrinsic motivation, as opposed to the extrinsic motivation, right? So the primitive economist account would emphasize the extrinsic motivation, while the intrinsic motivation is the motivation that is within us. And David focuses on this idea of being a cause as interpretation of intrinsic motivation. And it is interesting here that if we think of a metaphor for work that he promotes here, I think the most valuable metaphor would be the game. Actually, he thinks of work mostly as a game in which we are engaged. Just like those kids who are being taught to intervene in this world, to become a cause in this world by playing, and in this experience of playing, they actually get this feeling of causing things to happen. So for David, I think work is very close, or at least not non-compulsory work, is very close to the game. So basically, we would like to work because we enjoy the game, because this is a basic experience that we share. We want to enjoy the game. I think is one of the interesting questions for me is how close that comes to Marx's account of communism. Well, everyone knows, of course, that Marx has a very scarce remarks of what communism is, and his idea of communism, his descriptions of communism are very limited. But among them, there is this idea that communism means replacing the realm of necessity with the realm of freedom. And then humans in the communist society are pursuing their creative hobbies, and actually it could be read as though they were playing games all the time. So they are engaging in their activities because they like playing. They treat them as games they like to play. That's just a hunch for me. Probably there's something common between this idea of work as game and Marx's limited image of communism. Now, yet another question. I think I have two of them left. One of them is the idea of contribution that David also seems to emphasize here. Well, he through these two chapters, he seems to be emphasizing the idea that humans enjoy work because, if and only if, they feel that they contributed to some common good. This is what makes us really enjoy our work time, when we understand that we are performing some contribution and it is valued by others. So basically, when we feel that we are part of the common good, we are doing something useful. Actually, the book starts with the idea that there are people who would want to do something useful. And useful means contributing to the common good. And I think it makes a quite clear distinction between those who feel like they contributed to the common good and those who feel that they're not contributing anything. And this is the key for his definition of bullshit job, of course, because the definition of bullshit job is subjective definition. It is defined through the subjective element. Through the lack of feeling that you're contributing something. So I think it makes this distinction very clear, and the idea of contributing is very important for you. And that actually is very interesting, because this idea of contributing something to common good is actually, it comes actually from a well-established tradition in political thought, from the Republican tradition, from the idea that Republican form of being is defined through contributing something to the common goal, to the common good, to the actually that's the idea of the Respublica, the Respublica. And here David seems to have this idea in mind that that work or labor perhaps should be treated as politics, that the contribution through work is only valuable when it is a political contribution, when you are doing some good for the community in general, for the society in general. I think this is the reason why he always likes these cases where people shift when people shift from their boring bullshit jobs to political activism and immediately become happy. Because political activism is different from bullshit jobs precisely because it is rewarding. It creates a feeling of being a contributor to something of common value. That's an interesting question for me, whether that kind of treatment of labor, of work, presumes that it should always have a political dimension in it. And then, of course, the question might be asked whether this leads us to some sort of politicization of labor, or maybe even total politicization of labor. No labor is valuable unless it is politically consequential, at least unless it creates some political effects. And then probably one final question that arises for me here is the question of violence, because for David, of course, the labor that we are not choosing freely, the labor that we are not choosing, not choosing out of common good, is a labor that creates sadistic relationships. And he refers to Fromm here in these chapters, and is very good at showing this fundamental asymmetry of relations at work when bullshit jobs are involved. There's actually the relation, the sadistic and sadomasochistic relations of power, and this is exactly the game that you cannot escape. There is no stopword for that game. So the question for me here is whether we can think of work totally devoid or overcoming perhaps this sadistic component, or cleared of this sadistic component. The work that is absolutely transcending this sadism, or perhaps there is always this sadistic element in work, and we should think of transcending the work altogether, because that is obviously one of the lines of thinking that we have in this post-Marxist that we should probably think of ending the labor altogether. And in that case, this game would be a condition of post-labor. So this is just the scope of questions that seem interesting to me, and I already see some very interesting contributions in the chat. I think I'll leave it here, and please, guys, you're welcome with your contributions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Greg, and thank you everybody for coming. Anyone wants to jump in the conversation and try to answer some of Greg's questions?
Yeah, I already see a reference to Huizinga. Yeah, and that really helps. I mean, that really strengthens my view of work as a game.
Another very important reference about game is probably Roger Caillois.
Yeah, sure.
It's about the same period of time. I think he wrote that in the 30s. And it's actually a critique of Homo Ludens, where Caillois is saying, no, it's actually game is much more than what he's saying. So I'll add that to the library if people are interested. Dimitri, you want to say something?
Yeah, hi. I hope you can hear me. Grigori, thank you very much for the talk. I have a question about this Republican interpretation of Graeber's theory of labor. And it's a kind of practical question, because it seems to me that if we define value as a contribution to the community, that immediately leads to the question of what the community is and how do we define it, and who's going to be in charge of deciding what's actually is a contribution to some kind of community or society in general. And that strangely, it felt like a return to functionalist sociology, which would also probably define value of work by referring to some kind of contribution to the social organism in general. So I think this Republican reading will need to probably solve some political questions before. Well, I mean, there's this question of how do you define community, and who's gonna decide what's a contribution. Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you. Greg, do you want to say something, or do you want to take another question?
One thing I'm thinking about is that actually we have also within the Republican tradition, we have a very strong argument against identifying labor with political action, of course, and that comes from Arendt. And Arendt was actually thinking of labor as a spoiler to this political action. The labor has been induced by the economic reorganization of contemporary society, and actually of the original community becoming the contemporary society, administratively governed through this replacement of political action with work. This is the argument that she puts forward in the human condition. So yes, I think that's a good question, and it is specific. It is particularly good given that of course, David as an anthropologist has seen the occasions when you can more or less clearly define what the community is. For instance, when you are in Madagascar, that is much easier to define what community is and what it is not. But in a country like the United States or Russia, for that case, that's not that easy, of course.
Rachel, yeah, you wanted to jump in, yeah?
Hi, everyone. Not to be pedantic, but Dimitri, you used the term social organism when you were talking, and it makes me wonder if we need to define what a definition is actually of a community, because a social organism, or perhaps a biological organism, is something that functions kind of intuitively, naturally. It is a thing in itself. It is a part of the whole and the whole of the parts. And I wonder if one of the root problems of which bullshit jobs stem are the fact that we need to, like, the definition is always based on the other's understanding of the definition. It's not based on the inherent definition of the thing itself. That's all I have, I'm afraid. But sorry if it went a bit floofy.
No, thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with that. I just realized that my question was really about scale and scaling up, and that's a classic question. It always comes up when you think about how do you scale up certain arrangements that promote equality and are possible on small scale, but can't work at large scale.
Yeah, what is the community to decide on the contribution in those huge contemporary societies? That's the issue.
Yash? Oh, sorry, Michael. Can you just have to? Can you? Yeah. Oh, sorry. I didn't want to mute.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think just on the point, I think even the one which you brought about causality. So one of my favorite parts from the book, I don't think it's from this chapter, but it's I think chapter 5, where David's talking about sociological analysis, and what is really helpful, where it's part of this issue of the definition, right? How we listen, who do we really listen to? If it's the person with the job has to say that it's a bullshit job, but that's when it's a bullshit job. But basically he creates these 3 levels of explanation. So basically it's on page 154, like this book, the paperback. But basically the first question he wants to ask is, on the individual level, why do people agree to do and put up with their own bullshit jobs? So even if they know it's a bullshit job, why do they continue doing it? Then the second one, he says social and economic. So what are the broader forces at work that bullshit jobs come into existence? And then the third level is he says cultural and political level. So why is the bullshitization of the economy not seen as a problem, and why isn't anyone doing something about it? So that I found always really helpful, because it's a nice framework, and it approaches the problem from different perspectives, and you can apply it elsewhere as well, not just to bullshit jobs, I guess.
Yeah, thanks. I think he introduces this tripartite structure of the chapter just because he doesn't want to have all those things put in the same pot when he's trying to answer the question of why are there still so many bullshit jobs out there, and why the number is increasing. That I think is a very good idea to separate those levels, because people tend to mix them up and to come to crazy conclusions. But what I'm interested in here at this point is not so much why the bullshit jobs are spreading out there, but rather what would be the alternative to the alternative motivation. What would the world without bullshit jobs look like? What would people be driven by in a world without bullshit? So imagine we immediately start reducing the number of bullshit jobs one way or another. How would that feel? Wanting to perform a job, willing to perform some job, willing to do some work. What would drive me to do that work? That's thing that I'm thinking about it. Thank you.
Michael?
Yeah, so I was interested to hear Hannah Arendt mention her theory of labor as really something stupid and boring and repetitive, and action is where you kind of make a political choice, and of course, obviously, the labor movement is obviously based on, and the syndicalist movement, it comes out of a kind of an imagination of the factory worker who's trying to have some kind of control by stopping this kind of stupid production of labor. And so I wonder how one integrates the idea of building a labor movement that has a little bit of some type of action in what one does. I just flag Paulo Verno's book, Grammar of the Multitude, which is where I was introduced to Arendt's theory. And he kind of argues that in he's in the Italian autonomist tradition, and argues that there's a kind of that much of our work today is intellectual work, and so it becomes a common sort of our work is political because it's how you frame and think about stuff, even though in some sense it's still boring data repetitive work. So it's kind of atomized the sort of political choices and made workers do them, and is still in a labor-like process. But I guess my comment on the idea of Republican community, I mean, I don't know why you would use that framework. Kind of Republican goes back through, say, Rousseau, who's like, there's only one kind of, voice of the Republic, and that's the leadership, and basically suppresses the first workers' movements. And Republican as going back to, whatever, the Republic by Plato, which was a slave framework. And of course, it was a vision of a common identity, but it was a common identity that where there was a certain group of people that controlled that the identity of the community. Whereas what we should be looking at more like is, a gift economy, a small village, or Stone Age economics, if you will, that where the value is of an exchange is what decides is the world that people want to create. So people are constantly negotiating values in their exchange, and you come to have habits of this is cooperative and this is the world we want to live in. And that's what I would see as people define their community in their imagination. But from your imagination, you throw up that definition of a community, and you have as many definitions of the community as there are people. Then you have to figure out how it's going to work, right? But like, whereas a Republican definition starts with a theory and says this is what the community is, and then applies that to everyone. What if people don't agree with that? And then they end up in this kind of argument, and that would be the basic kind of argument between that Marxist Republican framework of here's the state and here is our community, and we'll build communism that way, and a bottom-up kind of growing a community way. So if you're, how do you build a define contribution as a worker? So your job is not bullshit, but you are part of arguing what that contribution is in your various exchanges. What would be the conditions of labor that allowed us to make decisions ourselves, and they worked for other community members, other people doing work.
That's a very good comment, I think. But one thing I'm not sure about is definitely there's this gift exchange theory. I think it certainly applies here. One thing I'm not sure about is whether we can easily match this idea of contribution that David seems to be stressing in those chapters with the gift exchange theory. I'm not sure that the gift exchange model is predicated on the feeling of contributing something to a logic, of creating some social value, as he puts it. This I think is might be tricky. So that might be two traditions meeting here, and certainly you're right that there is this discussion between, or rather not a discussion, but rather criticism of Arendt's separation of labor and politics by Negri and Virno, and in that sense, I think Graeber is much closer to the Italian tradition, because he tends to politicize labor. But still, I think this idea of contribution, once again, I'm not sure it appears in Virno or Negri. I'm not sure it really appears in gift exchange economy. But correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe we can get back to this idea of this republic idea, which I'm actually quite interested in, and maybe going back to Plato later. But it's Simona's turn now.
Hi. As for the question of which are the works, the jobs that are useful to the community and who decides, I think it is very important the how David stresses on subjective judgment on one's labor. He, in my opinion, I was a bit bored and astonished on how he stressed the subjective judgment on oneself job in the book, and but in my understanding, he does so exactly to get rid of the Marxist debate on what are the real needs of people, what are the really useful jobs, and who decides exactly. Everybody decides for himself or herself if his job is useful or not. And the very issue there is debunking. Debunking the idea that our jobs are useful. It's about pointing out the consequences of the very idea that we sell our time, and when our time is sold, it must be filled with something, and this something is useful because it has been sold, because somebody bought it. So let's put apart the idea of who decides what's useful for the community. When we'll have communism, we'll decide together what's useful for us, and the community shall share jobs in this way. But this is not the problem now. The problem now is to show what happens when jobs are no more necessary and are just a way to keep the power structure of the society. As for operaism, I think the very operaist idea in this book is the pleasure of being cause. The key concept of operaism is that workers own their job because they have the knowledge of it, and it is this knowledge and this possession of their power, of their job, of their workforce, is a power that they can use to overthrow the power structure of a society. And in last Negri thought, the idea is the same. Job is maintained just to maintain the power structure of the society, just as coercion, and just to force people in an order. And we maintain it because we cannot think of another kind of order for our societies.
Yeah, thank you. Can I just ask you a small question, short question? Well, imagine that also, I mean, I'm referring to your idea of communism as the way to settle all these issues with what is useful and what is not. But now that we are inhabiting those huge societies, well, now that we're not necessarily feeling part of a clearly defined community. Well, as for me, I'm not sure what community do I belong to, and then there might be different and even contradictory answers to the question of whether what I'm doing is actually useful, because I'm not sure useful for whom. And that echoes a little bit Dimitri's remark. I'm not quite sure how to make a judgment on that. I mean, useful for whom exactly? What is the collective that should be that I should refer when asking myself whether it is useful or not? Can you see the point?
But I'm not sure it really does matter. If you sing a song, even if you are a very bad singer, you are doing something that could be pleasant for somebody. What I mean is, let's get out of this trap that that a job should be useful. It can just be a play. In Italian, we have a concept that I like very much, that is agio. Agio is being comfortable, but it is also the space in machines that allows ingranaggi, machines to work. You need void, you need machines to play in order to have them to produce something. I think the key word is play, is having fun, is exactly not having a goal. And paradoxically, what is really useful is not having a goal. And what is productive, even for yourself alone. This should be separated from the issue of how do we build a road. In economics, building a road is the example for free riders. If 10 people need a road and the 10th one, I'm explaining for the others that may know not it. If 10 people need a road and one of them decides not to contribute to its building, the others cannot prevent him or her to use the road. So this is a free rider, and this is a problem in a community. But the problem of how sharing the work needed to have a road, how to share the resources needed to have a road, is a political problem and is a problem of sharing work, job. But it is a different issue towards what is useful. I think David's debunking is exactly in putting what is useful on the side of freedom. Useful is what is free, in contraposition with what is forced to be because you sold your time. I don't know if I explained myself.
Well, that's great. That's great. That actually makes me think of yet another tradition of Agamben thinking of promoting this idea of inoperativity, of the unproductive activities. That the activities that basically, this is the definition that he provides. The activities that have no goal. They don't produce anything. Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Greg, I was quite interested in your comment about the Republic, that you link it to this, and going back to Plato. It made me think about also. So let me start again. Chapter 3 ends with a discussion on time, and basically David is saying that many of the testimonies he got were saying that what was the most harmful for people who had a bullshit job is that it distracted them from their from meaningful things that they could do. First of all, they don't have time they can't do it while they're at work because their boss is supervising them, and they are supposed to pretend they are doing something. And when I come home, they don't have time to. And they don't have time, and also they're depressed, so they don't want to do anything meaningful, creative, and so on. And it really makes me think of what Plato was saying, because when Plato is talking about the Republic, he's actually excluding a whole part of the society. Craftsmen, for example, he says they don't belong to the same world. They don't belong to this world of thought and discussion politics, because they don't have time, because they have to work, and work doesn't wait. And this is actually something quite interesting, some sort of a revival of this rejoinder to Plato.
Well, yeah, but I must admit that when I was talking about the Republican tradition, certainly I was not thinking of Plato, nor of Rousseau. I was thinking of the classic Republican tradition that goes back to Cicero. And in that tradition, of course, the main thing that you're producing is liberty. And that goes back to Simona's comment that actually the most useful thing to be produced is freedom, is liberty. That's what I was thinking about. And of course, you can construct this Republican argument against Plato, who of course is not in this situation of compulsory work within those estates that he are creating. There's of course little room left for public action aimed at producing liberty and then enjoyment. So in that sense, yeah, of course. But I think that here probably David is just reconstructing this typical Republican argument against Plato. But yeah, that's correct.
Anyone that we didn't hear wants to intervene? Okay. Michael?
I know like the last time we talked about this book, it came out to a discussion of like, who decides what's a bullshit job? And that's maybe linked also to the idea of are bullshit jobs now increasing, and have we moved away from capitalism, right? And so we kind of agreed that people decided themselves what was a bullshit job. Although there was a debate about someone who got their first, there was an example of a woman who gets her first job, doing marketing, right? And for a TV thing, and somebody else thinks it's a bullshit job. But this woman is like, well, this is the first time I've ever been employed, and I'm now have power in my family. So she doesn't think it's a bullshit job because the common contribution that she's contributing to is her family, right? Whereas somebody else might think, well, I don't want to do a marketing job. I could do some other job, right? But that might be because they have an option to do some other job, or they at least can imagine doing some other job because they live in a different circumstance. So I guess I wondered about, I guess the difference between something's a bullshit job because it doesn't contribute to the profits of the company, right? So the idea that the manager is supposed to make sure that all the jobs are productive use of labor to contribute to the profits of the company within the logic of a capitalist system, right? But instead the manager comes and says, well, I'd like to play as well. I'd like to be the cause of my own effect. And he's actually useless. So he creates a lot of minions and hobnobs and a bunch of people that have to run around for a manager. And it's basically like this nonsense, right? And so the company is actually taking whatever profitability it has and putting it into supplying the manager with stuff rather than the company, right? And so that's one type of bullshit that most people can agree at a stockholder level, the stockholders might think that's bullshit. But then there's the other thing is, well, maybe the whole like there's the sort of job is bullshit in a meaningful way that everybody can say, well, this job doesn't really accomplish anything. That the company itself doesn't accomplish much, or it's destructive. Like like a job where, you know, like the finance industry, where they're making money, but they're basically just poaching money from someone else. There's not really production. There's this kind of nonsense going on in the finance sector. And I wonder, like, how people think about how we define what the different ways in which people define productivity, or different ways in which people define their job is making a contribution to something, and whether they get to define what productivity is or somebody else does, and how you build a condition in the workplace where people can have more of an emphasis on they say what is valuable in their work, or what would be valuable to work. I'm just going to stop here but I wondered if linking it back to those arguments about people subjectively make their own decision about what is a bullshit job helps us in terms of thinking about what constitutes a contribution.
Thank you, Michael. I found the interview. Oh yeah, Rachel, just to say, when you're next, I've just found this interview, the interview you mentioned, Michael, very interesting. This is also when Graeber talks about, I think it's an interview with Rachel, by the way. It's also when Graeber mentions rights scolding and you know, the check your privilege kind of discourse, and is quite critical about it. So maybe we can talk about it later. Rachel?
Yeah, I just wanted to spitball on what Michael was saying about defining the subjectivity of what is a bullshit job to somebody. And I think if you blow it out, it's also about, you know, like, what is a bullshit life to someone? Because the kind of dynamic that we're living in today, or the paradigm, is that one must work. And we pretend that there aren't enough resources, or there's not enough to go around to support the people who don't want to work. And that's a bullshit life for some people. So that's why we have to create these markets and these positions in order to employ people, because that's how one must live. Whereas if there was subjectivity allowed through just through being, or what one wants to be, what life one wants to have, and there was an acceptance also that there is enough resources to support that, well, then you would have people who, yes, are entrepreneurs and set up companies and work together like busy bees innovating things. Then you'd have people that are artists, you would have people that are homemakers, you would have people that do nothing. But to me, it's what's so interesting about bullshit jobs as sort of a punch to the gut when you hear the phrase is like, well, it's also about what kind of bullshit life we've all subscribed to, or we're being sort of forced to subscribe to. That's all.
Yeah, I think when I was listening to the LSE book reading on bullshit jobs, and people were asking or discussing about the criteria, one thing that struck me is that, you know, the 250 plus people who contributed to the book, we did have what we thought of as sort of objective arguments in favor of why we thought our jobs were bullshit. It may not have been the sort of bullet points, you know, like if it has, you know, these 3 criteria, then it's a bullshit job. Those were not the kinds of criteria we had. We had nuanced logical arguments based on, given that I think the vast majority of us were of the professional managerial class. So a lot of them were highly educated, you know, they were quite empowered. They got to see the effects of their work. They were hired because they were experts, and they had, I mean, I've seen quite a number of the testimonials personally, and I've spoken with some of the people who also contributed. They had nuanced arguments, and far more nuanced than having just a short laundry list of criteria. So that's always what disturbed me about the discussion about whether or not we're subjective about, you know, our jobs. It's another thing I noticed was that contributing to bullshit jobs was interesting in that David is a very, he's not like the usual person that you'd expect to be writing such a book. Like he respected us contributors, and he said that we're basically his co-writers. Many such people, you sort of, would build abstraction upon abstraction, whereas he started from our analyses and then built up his abstractions from that, rather than saying, starting from some other thinker who is some sort of theorist and building upon those theories until you sort of lose, oxygen atop, abstraction built upon abstraction. He started out from the very fundamentals, looking through each of the 250 plus testimonials and trying to, see the patterns within them and conveying those words near verbatim. So I think that he respected the reader, the contributors in a way that felt quite unusual.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's also for the critics. It's also where the scandal is in the methodology, because there is clearly a selection bias with the sample of people who are contributing to the book, because they are all most of them seems to be activists, seems to have some kind of a militant activity next to their bullshit jobs. And this is also Yash. You read this. You said many times that you read this. The first book he wrote about Madagascar, this ethnography. It is actually. It seems to me that it is written kind of the same way, with a lot of give people give people a voice in his book. They are basically co-writers. Yash.
I was literally just taking that book because basically like in the intro he kind of says something very similar that wait, it's right here. Like a lot of people, when he was like drafting like his ethnography, of people basically saying like, what's your main argument? He was like, that's how it's expected in academia, right? Like, you go in the field, you spend 2 years doing your field work and then come back and write a monograph on it. But like, basically he says this thing that people don't live their lives to prove some academic's point, right? And that kind of really sums it up, because I think he wants to like really tell the stories of like the people he's listening to, and then like draw inferences based on that. It's also kind of like what he was trying to do with like the ethnographic theory approach within anthropology, where he wanted to show like, it's like the real potential can come from anthropology, and like the theories come from inside the discipline, as opposed to like importing like the French theorists' philosophy or something. I also feel like with bullshit jobs, he was trying to do that, where like to TJ's point, right? Like he's really listening to like what people told him and like really drawing conclusions from that, and like he's not interested in like making a point if there isn't a point to be made, I guess.
Thank you. I'm a bit aware of time, but if some other people want to jump in, I suppose we can still extend it to few 10 more minutes. I wanted to go back to Rachel's comment about this belief that we have to work, and going back also to, so basically what is spiritual violence, because spiritual violence actually means something in a very different context, in the context of sects, basically. It's a belief that is basically used by someone to hurt. So is he basically making this argument that these kind of beliefs, these moral beliefs, that we have to work, that we are working on someone's time, is something that hurts?
That's interesting. That's interesting. Actually, the way I read this idea of spiritual violence here is in a quite Republican way. I mean, when you're not choosing a course of life or work for yourself, when you are being dictated to do something, when you're not engaged in a game, it is already a violence. It is non-freedom, and hence it is a violence. That was the way I was reading that. But actually, these reference to sex, it's interesting.
Yeah, personally, the way it at least manifested with me was that when you're in such an institution, and I like how let's see, Greg, you mentioned that the part about the sadomasochism, that's the part that most book reviewers totally ignore. Almost all reviewers totally ignore that part, where basically these bullshit jobs, I mean, what are they? If they're not there to do anything useful, people don't think they're doing anything useful, then what are they? It feels like a sort of role playing of a sadomasochistic dungeon without, you know, a chaste one. So without even whatever pleasures that might come from a normal sadomasochistic dungeon, S&M dungeon. There was this book that David mentioned once, and it really changed my worldview, called Sadomasochism in Everyday Life. And it made me realize that we think that sadomasochism is a very extreme thing, you know, something at the margins, a kind of perversion. And it turns out when you actually look at our world, it's quite dominant. This sadomasochistic logic is actually quite dominant. And we hyper-focus on this one little expression of it. So the vast majority, a great many of us are in what could be called sadomasochistic relationships when you expand the meaning of the term of sadomasochism. And those of us who've been in bullshit jobs, you know, we're doing this sort of endless S&M role play, basically, where, you know, someone's the boss, the other person's, you know, the subordinate. The subordinate can't say certain things, they can't get out, they don't have the safe word. It really changed my life. And so upon realizing that, I found ways to get out of the dungeon. You know, I sort of did the thing where you tell, I was working for two departments. I told one department I was working with the other one, and the other department I told, you know, I was working with this other one. They thought I was in the other office building. I wasn't. I was off, you know, at like Starbucks and eventually at my home. And when I came back from time to time to like meet people, it was really like talking to like people trapped in limbo or in you know, some purgatory. They were chattering about things that were totally irrelevant. They couldn't follow their internal wishes for things. In other words, your moral sense is what you want. I interpreted that as what you want to do with your life, something within you that says good or bad. They couldn't do that. So all of their conversations were totally unlike other conversations I have with people who get to do what they think is right. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm rambling on, and I don't think I necessarily had the point that I thought I had, so never mind.
TJ, I wanted to add this book to the library, but I just have the printed version of it. Do you have the PDF by any chance?
No, sorry, I also looked for the PDF. I have the printed version as well. I should probably scan it. We'll see.
Yeah, maybe we can do that in last resort.
I think that's actually...
Have you checked Library Genesis?
Yeah, it's not there.
Okay.
That's a great thing. Yeah, I was just going to say that's a great way to think about it. I mean, when listening to TJ, I was thinking that, well, it looks like all people are engaged in games all the time, but just some of them are not aware of that, and that makes them enter sadomasochistic relationships. It just takes a little shift to realize that you're playing a game, and then you immediately escape the S&M, or turn it into a good S&M with those stop words.
I found it. It's in Library Genesis.
Okay, then we'll add it.
There it is. I can send it to you, so you can put it in.
Oh, you can edit directly. Yeah. Any other interventions before we wrap up and make? Nika wanted to make some announcement, so that's your last chance. Maybe we can give it 4 more minutes to discussion before we end it up. No. Oh, okay, Nika.
I just
yeah.
had
Okay, Michael.
question that maybe I was trying to work through in terms of you see some theorists sort of focus on power relationships, power, and they just sort of theorize everything is power. More often, like people in social relationships don't analyze the power relationships. They kind of look at the meaning of things. And to some extent, some people say, well, the meaning is just defined by the power. But in some ways, if you're trying to say, change the world and don't take power, then and this is one, and this is my kind of question is where, like, the idea of sadomasochistic relationships, is talks about like a sort of meaning that's framed on a power of some individual. Whereas I was very taken by Simone's idea. I don't know if it's true, but like the idea that people would like to get rid of bullshit jobs, but they just don't know they want it. They don't have an imagination to have a different type of society. That's kind of quite interesting. This is not about the power issues. It's about an imagination. And I didn't know where Graeber felt what that might be something to explore in the future, that issue of whether it's this collectively produced social meaning that organizes society, and to what extent that is goes up against power. So obviously, a gift economy, people argue that it's collectively associated common meaning, whereas a coercive economy, it's much more about power. But in all of them, people agree some type of relationship. And I don't have an answer to that. Just a question. I don't know if that's useful for other people to think about future readings.
Yeah, but interestingly, I think in the very end of the book, Graeber seems to join Foucault in this idea that power in itself is not bad, and power is everywhere. And in that sense, power is just inherent to any kind of game. We are always playing those strategic games. That's just a difference between the controlled sadomasochistic game with the orange word and the uncontrolled sadomasochistic game where you cannot just you don't have any way out.
Oh, I think it's wrong. I think I'm not a philosopher, so you correct me. But my understanding is Foucault was thinking about the world as the power is everywhere, and you cannot get rid of that. You just live with this world as it is. And David, as being an anthropologist, he would just train to look at every society, every community, trying to figure out the way how the power is located and then point it out. But he truly believed that it would be possible to rearrange it. That's why it's a game and a play. And the difference between game and a play is a game has rules, and you can change these rules. You're still playing, but in a different game. And I think that's the difference between Foucault and Graeber. And Graeber really disliked Foucault in a way, So they were rivals, kind of. I also want to say about this Russian literature tradition. I just read this essay the other week in Nation about bullshit jobs and Gogol, Nikolai Gogol, Dead Souls. It's kind of compare these two books. And I really loved it because I think all this Russian tradition from Gogol to Dostoevsky is describing the world from the point of view of this small people, маленькие люди, and anthropologist tradition is doing exactly the same. It was just not normal for the Western European literature tradition before that. And so what David did, he just introduced into the nonfiction, somehow being an anthropologist. So he stopped talking about his grand narratives as a Republican narrative. And that is actually very interesting for coming from Russia, from European university, I think, yeah. And I have lots of friends who's developing that actively. And I would, it will be very interesting to explore, but I think it's David would disagree with that, like totally. He would just kind of also again, as with Foucault, he would try to to dismantle that idea. I don't know what you think.
No, I mean, definitely. I mean, we're trying to do some symbolic violence here. We're trying to encapsulate. At least I'm doing that. I'm trying to kind of encapsulate him into some sort of tradition, particularly the traditions that he obviously didn't associate himself with. So that's a sort of symbolic violence. But that's the destiny of any great thinker. These are the things we're always doing with that. So. Just no way out.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Greg, for coming and for facilitating this, and thank you everyone for coming too. Anika, you wanted to make some announcements for the next assembly?
Yes. So next week we will have a very long waiting assembly where it will be no reading groups, no discussion about new books, but an assembly in which we will present the new projects, and I will describe what I did, because I was mostly running a museum, let's say, as a curator for a while. And actually, I'm going to step out from that. And so I think next Thursday we can discuss what is the future of Museum of Care could be. And I also want to return, because not some people came and some people left, and I want to return to what Greg was saying in the beginning about the group of Russian students who is now on trial, and that is extremely important to help them somehow, because that's a kind of like, you know, just unbelievable that these people could face any prosecution. They literally like just was like a student magazine.
We actually prohibited to use the internet, so they could have been with us today easily, but now they have no legal access to the internet. So yeah, please sign the petition.
Yeah, the petition is in the chat. And yes.
Yeah, share it again.
And then after, so this is next Thursday will be an assembly when we will discuss, but we do have like a reading group schedule. I will also suggest, as I proposed last week, and some people agree with me who was in our meeting last week, that we should not do it every week. We should do it maybe a different schedule, because it's summertime and so on. For example, I will travel to New York soon. But we definitely will be on the 29th of April. After this week, we will do a reading group with Simona, who was planning it for a long time. We were planning this. And so maybe as a last wrap up, Simona can say a couple of words about this reading group.
Yes, it has been really a long time. Well, I suggested some time ago to have a reading group on Bakhtin on Carnival, because all of this has begun, for me at least, with the Carnival and with my enthusiasm for the very idea of making a carnival instead of a funeral or a vigil for David. And I wanted to discuss with you the revolutionary implications of this choice. And I think this choice is rooted in what Bakhtin said about Carnival, and in what David said in Possibilities, in the first chapter of Possibilities, about Bakhtin and how feasts and the body were treated in medieval tradition. And yes, what does it mean to have a carnival in different dimensions of it? So I suggest to have a reading group on the first chapter of Possibilities. I provide a Word file with just this page. It's 15 pages, I think, and the introduction to Rabelais, Mikhail Bakhtin Rabelais. I'll share it in the library, and please comment and so on. I would really love to discuss this concept with you.
Just one more thing, actually, Bakhtin has also wrote about Dostoevsky and about this polyphonic literature method of Dostoevsky, when he gave a voice to many people at the same time and breaking from the tradition of the this grand novels with the offer hero, offer voice. I think it's coming back to the Bushy Jobs and the methodology of how he just asked people what do they define by a meaningful job.
Sounds good. Yeah, sorry again for the wait, but thank you for your patience. And just to be sure, is it next week your reading group, or in a fortnight?
No, next group is the assembly, and then the Thursday after the assembly, 29th, is a reading group of Simona. So that's my proposal.
Sounds good. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, all. Thank you, Greg, for coming, facilitating, and
thank you all. Thank you for inviting.
And see you next week. Take care.